on the outskirts of a small town in the southern United States, where racial tensions have long been a part of everyday life, lives Angela Davis, a 30-year-old black woman. Angela is an experienced FBI agent who has dedicated her career to fighting crime and injustice. Her job requires discipline, endurance, and the ability to remain calm in the most difficult situations. One evening, returning home after a long and tiring day, Angela was driving along a deserted road. It was already dark, and she dreamed only of getting home as soon as possible and resting. Suddenly, the headlights of a police car appeared behind her. Turning on the siren, the policeman ordered her to stop. Angela slowed down and parked carefully on the side of the road. It flashed through her mind that she hadn't broken any rules, but knowing the dangers of dealing with the police for black people, she tried to remain calm. Angela took her identification from the glove compartment and placed it on the front seat. The policeman, a tall man with a frowning face, approached the car and began knocking on the window. Angela, keeping her cool, rolled down the window and asked politely, "Good evening, officer. What's the matter?" But the officer, without answering her question, demanded sharply, "Get out of the car, immediately." Angela felt anxiety rising inside her. She knew that situations like this could turn tragic, especially for black people, but she also knew that she had to remain calm and professional. "Officer, may I ask why I was stopped?" she asked cautiously. But instead of answering, the policeman suddenly pulled her out of the car, roughly grabbing her arm. Angela screamed in pain, but tried not to resist. The officer pushed her onto the hood of the car and began to put on handcuffs. At that moment, she realized that everything had gone wrong. "You are accused of resisting the authorities," he growled, clearly ignoring her attempts to explain. Angela tried to speak calmly. "Officer, there's my FBI badge in the glove compartment. Please take a look." But the policeman didn't listen. His face was twisted with rage and hatred. He grabbed her by the hair and threw her to the ground, continuing to shout accusations and insults. All her clothes were covered in mud, and her arms were bruised from the rough asphalt. Angela felt humiliated and helpless. She knew that this was not just random aggression, this was an act of violence born of racial hatred. And at that moment, she suddenly remembered the words of her mother, who always warned her about such situations. "Girl, the world is not fair, and you must be prepared for this." Angela felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she tried to hold them back. She knew that showing weakness now would be fatal. One thought pounded in her head like a hammer: you must survive. And then the policeman, still holding her on the ground, noticed her wallet had fallen out of her purse. He opened it, and his face suddenly changed when he saw the FBI ID inside. His hands began to shake, and he froze in place, as if waking up. The cop froze abruptly when he saw the FBI ID. He picked it up, peering at the photos and information, and for a moment something like horror flashed across his face. Everything that had happened in the last few minutes suddenly became real to him. He had attacked a federal agent, but instead of immediately apologizing and helping Angela to her feet, the fear in his eyes was replaced by something darker, more vicious. "You think this badge means anything?" he growled, squeezing her hand tighter. "You think it makes you special?" Angela, still lying on the cold ground, felt her body being overcome by unbearable pain. Everything that was happening seemed unreal. How could a person who had taken an oath to uphold the law be so cruel? "Officer, you were making a huge mistake," she barely squeezed out, trying to breathe through the pain. "A mistake?" His voice was full of sarcasm. "It was a mistake to let you, the likes of you, serve in the FBI." Those words hit her harder than any physical action. She knew that in his eyes. She wasn't a person, just a target for his hatred. It was deeper than just racism, it was an insult to who she was, what she had achieved, and everything she had fought for. Meanwhile, cars drove by, but no one stopped. In the darkness, on the side of the road, the scene was almost invisible to strangers. Angela felt completely alone, abandoned in a world where justice was only an illusion. Finally, the officer let go of her hand and stood up, as if he had made up his mind. He looked down at her angrily, as if assessing his next move. Then he walked back to his car, leaving her lying on the ground. Angela tried to stand up, but her strength was leaving her. She felt her head spinning and everything was starting to blur before her eyes. She knew she should call for help, but the words wouldn't come. In that moment, she realized how fragile her life was, how easily it could be broken. The officer returned, holding her gun, which he had pulled from her bag. He stood over her with a cold determination in his eyes. "You know, if you were just another victim, no one would have noticed you were missing," he said quietly, as if sharing a secret thought. Angela looked at him with horror, but also with some strange determination. She knew that even if this moment was her last, she would not let him feel like a winner. But instead of shooting or hitting her again, he threw the gun on the ground next to her and began to back away, as if thinking about something. "You will not tell anyone about this," he said, almost in a whisper, but with a threat in every word, "because if you do, I will find you, and believe me, next time there will be no badges to save you." Angela was left lying on the ground as he got into his car and drove away, leaving her in the dark and alone. Every minute felt like an eternity as she lay there, feeling the pain and fear intertwining in her soul. As the police lights disappeared over the horizon, Angela managed to get to her feet. She was shaking, and her head was ringing. She should have called the station, reported what had happened, but the officer's words were ringing in her head, and she knew this nightmare was just beginning. With a heavy heart and a feeling of utter helplessness, she got back into her car. The world she knew seemed alien and hostile to her. Angela looked in the rearview mirror, seeing her own eyes full of tears and bitterness. She knew that from this moment on, her life would never be the same. After Angela had struggled home, her soul was torn apart. Every movement was painful in her body, and her head was pulsing with thoughts of what had happened. She sat on the couch in her small living room, surrounded by a silence that seemed deafening to her. Her hands were still shaking from shock, and she could see the face of the policeman, full of hatred and contempt. Everything inside her screamed at the injustice, but she knew she had to act rationally. She picked up the phone and, her hands shaking, dialed her boss at the FBI. He was the only person she could trust with her story. The voice on the other end of the line was serious when he answered. "Angela, what happened?" "I was pulled over by a police officer." Her voice shook, but she tried to speak clearly. "He attacked me, and then he saw my badge, but that didn't stop him. He threatened me, and I think he's going to try to cover up what he did." "Are you safe?" The boss spoke quickly and confidently. "Physically, yes, but I'm afraid he won't stop there, and I'm afraid the system I believed in won't protect me." The words came with difficulty. Each word seemed to drain the last of her strength. "You must file an official report immediately. We will launch an internal investigation," the chief said confidently. "We will not allow this matter to be hushed up." Angela nodded. Even though she knew he couldn't see her, she knew she had to report it, but she was afraid. Deep down, she knew the system she served wasn't always fair. Too many times she'd seen cases hushed up, victims left unprotected, and perpetrators steered clear. The next morning, Angela drove to the FBI office. Overcoming pain and fatigue, she walked into the building, trying to hold her head high, but inside, chaos was raging. She felt the eyes of her colleagues on her, but she said nothing to anyone. After writing a report, she handed it to her boss, who promised that the matter would be reviewed immediately. However, days passed and there was no answer. Every time she asked about the progress of the investigation, she was given vague answers, citing the need for a thorough check of all the facts. Angela saw how her case was beginning to sink into bureaucratic red tape, and the fear inside her grew. A few weeks later, she was called to a meeting with an internal investigator. Angela walked into the office to find 3 men waiting for her, 2 of whom were her FBI colleagues and the third a police officer. His presence made her wary, but she tried to hide her unease. The interrogator began asking questions, and Angela answered them honestly, describing everything that had happened that night. But as the interrogation went on, she began to notice how their questions became more pointed, almost accusatory. "Why didn't you stop immediately when you heard the siren?" one of the investigators asked, as if leading her to the idea that she had provoked the situation herself. "I stopped as soon as it was safe," Angela replied, containing her excitement. You said he grabbed you, but maybe you resisted, maybe your actions could have been perceived as a threat," the other continued. Angela felt her nerves starting to fray. It was like the nightmare all over again, only now it was happening in the office where she was supposed to feel safe. "I didn't resist. I was just trying to explain that I was an FBI agent," she said with difficulty. The investigator suddenly spoke to the police, his voice dry and dispassionate. "Our investigation has shown that the officer acted in accordance with instructions. He claims that you were aggressive and did not follow his commands. The situation was tense, and he made the decision to use force." These words sounded like a sentence. Angela felt the ground slipping from under her feet. She looked at these people, hoping to see at least a hint of understanding, but their faces remained cold and indifferent. "But that's a lie," she cried, unable to contain her emotions. "I didn't do anything. I was only trying to protect myself." "We understand this is a difficult situation," one of her colleagues said dryly, avoiding her gaze, "but we have no reason to doubt the officer's testimony. We recommend that this case be closed for lack of evidence." The world around her began to crumble. Angela realized that the system she served refused to protect her, that truth and justice were empty words in this office. Her report was rejected, and the officer who attacked her went unpunished. As Angela left the FBI building, she felt her strength finally drained. She didn't know what to do next, where to go. Her faith in justice was shattered, and she realized that it would be impossible to fight alone. Angela returned home, feeling the darkness closing in on her. That night, she sat on the couch, staring into space, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to cry. She realized that she had lost a battle that had begun long before the policeman had pulled her over. The system she had trusted and served had betrayed her, and now she was alone in a world that was far crueler than she could have ever imagined. Angela knew she couldn't go on like this, but she saw no way out. She knew her story wouldn't be told, her pain wouldn't be acknowledged. She'd just be another victim in a long line of those whose lives had been ruined by injustice and betrayal. Several weeks had passed since her last meeting with internal investigators. Angela tried to move on with her life, but her world was never the same. She continued to come to the office, doing her job, but she felt as if she was living in the shadow of herself. Each day began with the hard realization that the system she once thought was the pillar of justice was an empty facade. Her colleagues, those who knew about what had happened, tried not to bring it up. They talked to her as if nothing had happened, but Angela noticed how they began to avoid her, how a strange tinge of mistrust appeared in their eyes. She felt like she was being isolated, gradually pushed out of the team, made invisible. Her boss, with whom she had once been able to talk about anything, now also avoided long conversations. He was clearly uncomfortable in her presence, as if he didn't know what to say, or maybe he simply didn't want to admit that his subordinate was a victim of injustice in the system he himself supported. One day, Angela noticed that she was being sidelined from important matters. She was reassigned to a desk job, where she had to do routine tasks unrelated to field operations. It was a slap in the face for a seasoned agent like her. It meant one thing: she was no longer considered reliable. Angela tried to fight the feeling of helplessness and despair. She tried to find the strength to continue, but with each passing day her soul was torn apart by pain. She tried to turn to a psychologist, who was offered to her at the bureau, but those sessions only increased her feeling of isolation. All her words about injustice, about how she felt betrayed, seemed empty in this sterile room, where she was offered only standard recommendations for stress relief. And then one evening, when she returned home after another day of pointless paperwork, Angela found a letter in her mailbox. It was an anonymous letter, typed on plain paper, with no return address. It contained only a few lines. "You think you can just walk away? We know where you live. We know who you really are. If you try to tell anyone else, they'll never know." Angela felt her heart skip a beat. She read the words over and over, trying to understand what they meant. It was a threat, clear and terrifying. The fear she had been trying to suppress flared up again. She knew her life was in danger, and that she was in a situation from which there was no escape. That night, Angela barely slept. Every sound in the apartment seemed like a threat, every rustle a harbinger of trouble. Her mind was filled with fear, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The next day, she dragged herself out of bed and decided not to go to work. For the first time in her career, she simply couldn't bring herself to leave the house. She spent the entire day sitting by the window, looking out onto the street, feeling the world around her become increasingly alien and hostile. A few days passed, and Angela finally lost hope. She stopped going to work, turned off her phone, and cut herself off from the world, which she no longer saw any meaning in. Her life turned into a series of monotonous days filled with fear and loneliness. Finally, one evening, when the darkness had completely swallowed her consciousness, she made a decision that seemed to her the only way out. She sat down at the table, wrote a letter in which she described everything that had happened to her, all her experiences and feelings. She wanted at least someone to know her truth, even if she was no longer around. Then, leaving the letter on the table, she took a few sleeping pills, washed them down with water, and lay down on the bed. She closed her eyes, feeling how sleep slowly covered her, carrying her away to a world where there would be no pain and fear. The next day, she was found dead. The police recorded her death as a suicide. Only a few people learned of the contents of the letter she left behind. The Bureau quickly hushed up the event, framing it as the tragic loss of an employee who had failed to cope with personal problems. Her death was another unnoticed cry for help in a world where justice and truth remain the privilege of the few, and the lives of those who fight for them often end in silence and oblivion. A few days after Angela's death, her letter accidentally fell into the hands of a journalist named Melissa Harper. Melissa, known for her investigations into police brutality and injustice in the justice system, immediately sensed that there was something more to the tragic incident. Angela's letter was filled with pain, despair, and most importantly, the truth that no one wanted to hear. Melissa made a decision. She had to find out what really happened to Angela Davis. This case had become personal to her. She began her investigation by contacting several sources within the FBI, using all her contacts to gather information. Her experience and intuition told her that this was not a simple suicide, but a systematic suppression of the truth. But the deeper she dug, the more obstacles she encountered. Her inquiries to the Bureau went unanswered. Many refused to talk about the matter, and some even warned her that she should leave the matter alone. But Melissa was stubborn and determined. She knew that someone wanted to hide the truth about what happened to Angela. Gradually, she managed to piece together the pieces of information. She found several of Angela's colleagues who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. They described how Angela had changed after the incident with the police officer, how she had begun to be suspended from work, and how she had become increasingly withdrawn. One colleague even shared that he had heard talk that Angela's case was being deliberately hushed up at the highest levels. Melissa also learned the name of the officer who had attacked Angela. It was Officer John McCarthy, who had been the subject of several abuse of power complaints before, but had always escaped punishment thanks to his connections within the police and local government. All indications were that he was not alone in his desire to suppress the truth. There was a system behind him. Melissa published the first article about Angela's death, revealing details about her life, her work, and the incident that brought her to the brink. The article caused a stir, and people began discussing Angela's case, demanding justice. But with it came threats. She was warned that if she did not stop her investigation, her fate could be just as tragic. Melissa, however, was not deterred. She continued her work despite the fear and pressure. She knew that Angela did not deserve what happened to her and that the truth had to be told, regardless of the consequences. Shortly after, Melissa received a video from an anonymous source. It was a surveillance video that captured part of the unfortunate incident with Angela. The video showed Officer McCarthy roughly pulling her out of the car, verbally abusing and threatening her. It was irrefutable evidence that supported Angela's story. Melissa was now confident that she would be able to shed light on the truth. However, when she tried to hand the recording over to the authorities to initiate a new investigation, she found that the recording had suddenly gone missing. All the copies she had made were gone. Her computer had been hacked, and the original source was no longer in contact. Fear for her life began to permeate her every thought, but Melissa knew she couldn't back down now. Melissa eventually held a press conference where she announced that she was ready to tell the truth she had uncovered. She knew that if she spoke publicly, it would be harder to silence her. However, a few days before her scheduled appearance, Her car was found burned out on a deserted road. The body inside was so badly charred that it was not immediately identified, but identification found nearby belonged to Melissa Harper. Her death shocked the public, and this event generated even more interest in the Angela Davis case. People began to take to the streets demanding justice, and pressure mounted on the FBI and the police. But despite the public outrage, officials remained silent, dodging questions and avoiding any promises. The case of Angela and Melissa remained unsolved. What should have been a victory for truth and justice became another chapter in a long history of corruption and abuse of power. Angela and Melissa became symbols of a struggle that was still going on, but now without them. Years later, their names were still remembered at civil rights marches, and their stories were told as warnings of how far the system could go if left unchecked. And while justice was never served, their memories lived on in the hearts of those who continued to fight for what was right. Despite the public outrage and public outcry, the case of Angela Davis and Melissa Harper slowly began to fade from the news. The system that had long suppressed the truth seemed to be getting back on its feet. But for many who lived through this tragic event, the fight was just beginning. In the wake of these events, a new generation of activists emerged to raise questions about racism and corruption in law enforcement. One such activist was Jamal Brown, a 28-year-old black attorney who saw the deaths of Angela and Melissa as an embodiment of systemic racism. Jamal, like Angela, was part of the system, but his goals were the opposite. He decided to use his legal skills to fight corruption and racial injustice. Realizing he had to tread carefully, Jamal began his investigation. He worked to build the legal foundation for a lawsuit that would expose the facts of what had happened to Angela. Jamal knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help from others who also felt the system needed to change. He reached out to several victims of police violence and racism to gather testimonies and build a picture. One of his key allies was Sarah Lee, a victim of a racist attack who had also faced systemic injustice. Sarah was a well-known activist who had been fighting for the rights of black people and other marginalized groups for years. Together, they began compiling lawsuit materials and posting them on social media, drawing attention to systemic racism. They spoke about how the system covers up police crimes, how important evidence disappears or is ignored, and how black people often fare worse in the legal system. But they faced a whole front of opposition. In response to their actions, a smear campaign began. Articles appeared in the media claiming that Jamal and Sarah were extremists, that they were only inciting hatred and racism. Their work was constantly attacked and distorted. Jamal himself was isolated and threatened. He began to receive threats not only from anonymous individuals, but also from high-ranking officials who tried to suppress his activities. His own office had been ransacked and important materials had been stolen. Jamal and Sarah realized they were in danger, but they continued their work, not allowing fear to paralyze them. At the same time, Jamal noticed something particularly disturbing. Police officers, including McCarthy, began to act more aggressively toward blacks and other minorities in their neighborhood. It was a show of force, a response to the increased activism of civil rights activists. The police, feeling impunity, continued to violate citizens' rights, and racism became even more overt and routine. One day, during one of the street protests to which Jamal and Sarah had invited all their supporters, the police raided. The protesters were dispersed with force, and several people were injured, including Sarah. She was arrested and subjected to harsh treatment at the police station. Jamal, seeing that her health was deteriorating, did everything possible to get her released. The situation became critical. Sarah, despite her severe injuries, was forced to spend several days in prison, where her condition only worsened due to the lack of medical care. Jamal continued to fight for her release using all available legal means, but it turned out to be a difficult and exhausting process. When Sarah finally left prison, she was in poor health. Her health had been severely damaged by the abuse, and she needed a long recovery. The case became another symbol of how far the system will go to suppress those who try to fight for the truth. Jamal and Sarah continued their work, but each time they did so, they faced new challenges. They were subject to constant threats, surveillance, and even acts of violence. Jamal also faced attempts to undermine his career and reputation, and he felt pressure every day. Their fight was becoming increasingly personal and dangerous, but Jamal and Sarah were determined to fight for justice. Even though their own lives and safety were at risk, they knew that if they did not continue to fight, their voices and the voices of those suffering from racism and corruption would go unheard. So, Angela and Melissa's story did not end there. It lived on in those who tried to fight for truth and justice despite systemic obstacles and threats, and her memory inspired many to continue the fight against injustice and racism. As Jamal and Sarah continued their fight for justice, they faced a new and dark phase in their work. The hatred and racism they fought against became more visible and dangerous. Following a series of protests and media coverage of their work, public attention to their case attracted the attention of not only advocates of justice, but also those who were committed to racist views. Under the banner of preserving order and fighting anarchy, they began to receive threats and intensified acts of hatred. One morning, Jamal discovered that threatening messages had been left on the door of his apartment. Someone had used spray cans to write, "Blacks are not wanted here and get out of our neighborhood." The messages were accompanied by symbols of racist groups, indicating that the action was part of a larger hate campaign. However, the dangers did not end there. Jamal and Sarah began receiving direct threats via social media and anonymous phone calls. Each message contained a clear threat of violence against them. Some of these threats were so specific that Jamal and Sarah began to fear for their lives. One day, during a street protest led by Jamal and Sarah to draw attention to racism and police brutality, a crowd of protesters clashed with counter-protesters. These counter-protesters were known members of racist groups such as the White Front and the Sons of the Confederacy. Their slogans and signs left no doubt about their intentions. They called for violence against blacks and other minorities. The protests turned violent. Jamal and Sarah tried to keep the peace and organize protection for the peaceful protesters, but their opponents were aggressive and armed. The police, instead of intervening and protecting the protesters, stood aside as if they did not care about the outcome of the events. The clashes left many people injured. Jamal and Sarah were brutally beaten. Jamal was seriously injured, and Sarah, already suffering from the effects of her previous arrests, was beaten unconscious. When they were taken to hospital, doctors found that Jamal had several broken ribs and serious internal injuries, and Sarah had a concussion and multiple bruises. These events attracted media attention, but in the context of increasing racist violence and social division, many media outlets did not pay enough attention to them. Some even used the situation to incite hatred and prejudice, justifying violence allegedly justified by the actions of the protesters. The influence of racist propaganda and smears undermined their efforts, turning them into targets for even more overt attacks. After the attack, Jamal and Sarah ended up in hospital, and their recovery time was filled not only with medical procedures but also with mounting hostility. Growing pressure from racist groups and the suppressive measures of local authorities made their lives increasingly unbearable. Racist hatred and violence became part of their daily reality, and it was extremely difficult to combat. Amid their physical and emotional exhaustion, Jamal and Sarah felt their efforts begin to falter. Each day brought new threats and attacks, and they began to wonder if they had the strength to continue. They were exhausted and frustrated that the system they were trying to change was so deeply infected with hatred and bias. However, their resilience and courage did not fade completely. Despite threats and violence, they continued to speak out about racism and systemic issues. Their support from community organizations and allies remained, and they tried to use every opportunity to keep the tragedies and injustices they had experienced alive. Their fight became a symbol of determination and resilience in the face of hatred and violence, but also a reflection of how far racist hatred can go when it is not effectively resisted. Jamal and Sarah continued to fight despite mounting pressure and danger, and their efforts became part of a larger fight for equality and justice. Following the attack on Jamal and Sarah, new layers of hatred and violence began to accrue to their lives and work. While their story continued to attract the attention of human rights defenders and activists, racist groups and individuals increased their attacks to suppress their efforts and intimidate their supporters. Soon after the incident, Jamal and Sarah returned to work despite their injuries. They began working with lawyers and advocacy groups to prepare a new lawsuit aimed at holding those who incited violence and racism accountable. But every step forward was fraught with new obstacles. One day, Jamal discovered that his office had been robbed. The thieves not only stole important documents and materials, but also left behind a threatening note. "We know what you're planning. If you don't stop, next time it won't just be papers." Over the next few weeks, the hatred continued to mount. White supremacist groups began organizing rallies and protests against what they called Jamal and Sarah's un-American efforts. They distributed leaflets and waged an aggressive social media campaign, highlighting Jamal and Sarah as a threat to white society. The propaganda portrayed them as enemies who were trying to destroy American values and openly called for violence against them. One night, Jamal and Sarah discovered that their homes had been attacked. Graffiti appeared on the facades of their buildings with racist slogans such as "Death to Blacks," "Go back to your ghetto," and symbols of racist groups. That evening, they received a threatening phone call from an unknown person who warned them that they could be the next victims if they did not stop their activities. Not content with words alone, racist groups have begun to take more active action. One day, while Jamal and Sarah were at yet another demonstration to draw attention to their cause, a group of violent protesters espousing racist views attacked them. They were armed with sticks and other objects, and despite the presence of police supposedly providing security, the attack was brutal and sustained. These clashes not only resulted in physical violence, but also an emotional impact on Jamal and Sarah. They became targets of personal attacks and humiliation. They also experienced increased hostility from locals who espoused racist views or were simply afraid to openly show support for the activists. One day, when Jamal returned home, he found his car burned to the ground. Next to the charred remains of his car, a message was left written on the side of the building: "Nobody wants you here. Get out or you'll be next." This event was the culmination of the mounting pressure and hatred they had been experiencing. Jamal and Sarah found themselves under constant threat and pressure, even among those who had sincerely supported their cause. Uncertainty set in, and fear began to suppress action. Many began to doubt the wisdom of continuing the fight and feared that their support could lead to the same consequences. In this climate of fear and hatred, Jamal and Sarah continued their work despite the mounting threats. They held several press conferences and interviews to explain what was happening and to call for peace and respect. Despite the constant pressure, their resolve remained unwavering. However, with each passing day, it became increasingly clear that confronting systemic racism and hate-based violence was becoming more difficult. The racism and bias they were trying to overcome seemed more deeply ingrained in society and the system. In the face of constant violence and threats, their work became an arduous and dangerous feat that they were trying to accomplish despite all the challenges. Jamal and Sarah's story became a symbol of the fight against racism and hatred, but also a reflection of the difficult reality they faced. Their efforts to expose racist violence and corruption continued to attract attention, but also increased the hostility of those who did not want to see change. They remained at the forefront of the fight for justice, despite all the threats and risks that constantly followed them. Despite constant threats and violence, Jamal and Sarah never gave up hope for justice. Their fight became increasingly complex and confusing, but they continued, hoping that their efforts could lead to change. However, their efforts soon began to reveal new, dark, and unexpectedly intriguing aspects of the case. One night, while Jamal was working in his office, he discovered that one of his files was missing. It was a file of documents he had been collecting about the financial connections of police officials and racist groups. Jamal was certain that the file had been stolen, which made him suspicious that someone close to him might have been involved in the theft. Despite the risk, Jamal decided to conduct his own investigation. He knew it could be dangerous, but he also knew that if the information fell into the wrong hands, it could undermine their entire effort. He began investigating who might have had access to his office. His suspicions were soon confirmed when he discovered that one of his trusted lieutenants, who had been at the center of all his activities, had suddenly disappeared. This assistant, named David, was an active supporter of their cause and helped them a lot with organizing and collecting data. Now he was missing and his phone was disconnected. Jamal started looking for him and soon it became clear that David was involved in some shady dealings related to racist groups. Large transfers from suspicious people were found in his bank accounts. Jamal and Sarah then decided to take action and sought help from a private detective who specialized in solving financial crimes. The detective, named Lana Baker, agreed to help them and began investigating. Lana discovered that David may have been recruited by racist groups and that his mission may not only be espionage but also sabotage of their work. The situation became more complicated when Lana found evidence that some of the new threats against Jamal and Sarah may have been linked to high-profile figures in the government and police. These people may have been playing a double game, publicly supporting anti-racism while secretly aiding racist groups. One day, when Jamal and Sarah were holding a fundraiser for their work, Lana gave them some sensational findings. She had discovered that high-ranking officials had contacts with racist groups, and that they were funding and supporting violence against activists to create a climate of fear and suppress the movement. Jamal and Sarah began working to expose these connections, but the situation became even more complicated when a high-profile official who was at the center of the case died unexpectedly under mysterious circumstances. The official version was that it was an accident, but Jamal and Sarah were certain that was not the case. They suspected that it was a murder intended to hide important evidence and stop their investigation. Soon after, Jamal and Sarah were subjected to even more targeted attacks, leaving them feeling like they were on the brink of something much deeper and more dangerous. Their homes were ransacked and their personal belongings were torn or destroyed. New threats began to appear on the streets, and public sentiment began to turn against them. Thanks to a well-organized smear campaign, Jamal and Sarah felt they had to take drastic action. They decided to seek help from several influential human rights organizations and journalists to work together to expose the truth, but they also knew they had to be careful and hide their true intentions to avoid becoming the next victims. Meanwhile, Lana has discovered that there are not just white supremacist groups behind this, but a web of political manipulation and corruption. This has led to Jamal and Sarah's investigation, despite threats and violence, becoming part of a larger, more complex plan to expose deep, systemic abuses. But every new discovery and every step forward also brought new dangers and intrigues. Jamal and Sarah found themselves in the middle of a fight not only for justice, but also for their lives. In this fight, they understood that they had to do everything possible to uncover the truth, even if it cost them everything they had. With tensions and threats mounting, Jamal and Sarah continued their efforts to uncover the truth. Despite the dangers, Lana Baker, a private investigator, supported them, but also found herself in the middle of a complex and dangerous investigation. Soon, they all realized that the case was becoming more complex and dark, exposing corruption and manipulation. With Lana's help, Jamal and Sarah began to gather evidence that supported their suspicions of high-profile connections between police, politicians and racist groups. One of the key pieces of evidence were internal documents obtained from police sources that showed officials were involved in corruption schemes and cover-ups. Secret meetings between high-profile officials and leaders of racist groups became the basis for a new wave of revelations. Lana found records of financial transfers that indicated secret agreements and agreements on joint actions. These documents also outlined specific actions to suppress human rights activists and their activities. Murder of an official. The death of a high-profile official connected to the investigation was more than just a tragic accident. Lana discovered that the official was about to reveal information that could have brought down a network of corruption and racism. Jamal and Sarah began to suspect that his murder might have been an attempt to cover up and stop their investigation. Lana confirmed that before his death, the official tried to hand over evidence and warn about the plans of racist groups. However, before he could do so, his death was declared an accident, and all the evidence he had collected was destroyed or hidden. New threat. During this time, Jamal and Sarah began to face new threats. Their personal information was compromised, and they began to receive messages demanding that they cease their activities. Some of these threats were so specific that they began to suspect that their activities were being tracked and that their lives were in immediate danger. The racist groups continued to escalate their attacks. One day, Sarah returned home to find her apartment had been broken into. Inside, she found a bloody note with threats and photos of her and Jamal taken in their private moments. The threats were a tangible reminder that they were in mortal danger. External support and betrayal. In the face of heightened threats, Jamal and Sarah decided to seek help from international human rights organizations and journalists. They hoped that international attention would help protect them and ensure their safety. However, when they began sharing their information with the wider community, they faced further betrayal. Some of those who presented themselves as allies began to turn against them. It turned out that several representatives of human rights organizations were in contact with racist groups and used their positions to sabotage the efforts of Jamal and Sarah. These traitors helped spread false information that compromised their reputations and weakened their position. Conclusion. The result of all this left Jamal and Sarah in an extremely vulnerable position. they were still being persecuted by racist groups supported by corrupt elements within the government. Their resources were depleted, and the betrayal of loved ones made matters even more difficult. However, they did not give up. In the last weeks of their struggle, they made a last attempt to expose the whole truth. Jamal, despite his physical and emotional fatigue, prepared a final report that could be a real blow to corrupt authorities and racist groups. They used their last resources to submit it to international courts and obtain protection. Together with Lana, they organized a press conference where they planned to present evidence of corruption and violence. But on the eve of the conference, Sarah received a message that all their efforts could be thwarted and that their lives were in danger. The situation became so critical that Jamal and Sarah began preparing for a possible secret exit, realizing that this could be their last chance to preserve any hope for justice. Jamal and Sarah's story continued to be fraught with danger and intrigue, and their determination in the face of mounting violence and betrayal remained the last bulwark against deep-rooted racism and corruption. Ultimately, their fight could become not only a symbol of the fight for justice, but also a warning of how difficult and dangerous it can be to expose systemic abuses in the face of overwhelming opposition. In the face of increasing violence and systemic racism, Jamal and Sarah continued to fight for justice despite increasing pressure and threats. Their story gained widespread attention, but also attracted the attention of those opposed to their efforts. The new part of their fight brought even more hatred and bias, making their situation even more difficult. Spreading hatred, racist groups, having learned about the impending exposure, became active and began a large-scale hate campaign against Jamal and Sarah. Their activities included not only threats and violence, but also organized actions aimed at discrediting the activists in the public consciousness. Fake news and fake stories began appearing on local news channels, portraying Jamal and Sarah as traitors and a threat to public safety. Their actions were portrayed as radical and their investigations were said to incite hatred and division in society. In parallel, memes and videos spread on social media that distorted the facts and encouraged violence against them. Mobilization and attacks. Racist groups began openly calling for violence. They organized rallies and marches where they openly expressed their antipathy towards black people and those who support their rights. At these rallies, they unfurled banners with offensive slogans such as "Cleanse our country of blacks" and "Fight the traitors." In the wake of this campaign, Jamal and Sarah had become targets of direct attacks. One of the most notable examples was the attack on Sarah's home. One night, while she was home alone, several masked men burned her house down, leaving the following message: "This is what all traitors will look like." Fortunately, Sarah was not harmed, as she had been warned and had time to evacuate, but the attack demonstrated the growing aggression and hatred. Police inaction and support for hate. The situation was further complicated when the police, who were supposed to protect Jamal and Sarah, actually began supporting racist groups. The police ignored requests for protection and to investigate the attacks, and in some cases, they appeared to facilitate the attacks themselves. In one incident, when Jamal and Sarah filed a complaint about threats and violence, the police were hostile, asking derogatory questions and implying that they were instigating the violence. One officer even suggested that Jamal should go back to his job, a reference to his activism and work. International reaction and internal conflicts. In response to the international attention to the case of Jamal and Sarah, some human rights organizations tried to support them, but internal conflicts also began within these organizations. Some members, influenced by racist groups or because of their own preconceived notions, began to express doubts about the veracity and usefulness of the investigation. This created tensions and led to a deterioration in relations with international allies. In addition, a wave of criticism began to mount in the media against the activists, who were now accused of creating a separatist agenda and inciting racial hatred. These accusations resonated with some of the public, leading to a worsening of public opinion about Jamal and Sarah. False news and manipulation created the illusion that they themselves were the source of the conflict. Trying to survive and uncover the truth, under increasing pressure and threats, Jamal and Sarah continued their work, but their resources and strength were dwindling. They began to carefully conceal their whereabouts and plans to avoid further attacks and threats. Lana Baker, Their private investigator worked to gather the last clues and prepare an international report that could shed light on the entire web of racist and corrupt connections. Despite growing hatred and prejudice, they continued to seek protection and support. They had to rely on anonymous sources and support from international human rights groups that, despite internal tensions, remained committed to justice. Their lives became less hopeful and more uncertain. Jamal and Sarah knew that their struggle was part of a much more complex and dangerous situation, where racist forces and political corruption created a darkness from which it was extremely difficult to escape. But their determination continued to sustain them, even when it seemed like the whole world was against them. Their story thus became not only a fight for justice, but also a symbol of resistance to systemic racism and bias that permeates every level of society. Every day of their lives was filled with new threats and challenges, but their desire to reveal the truth and bring about change remained unchanged. As the growing pressure from racist groups and systemic racism became more and more palpable, Jamal and Sarah found their efforts increasingly complex and difficult. The reality of fighting a system riddled with bias and trying to stay safe became the biggest challenges of their lives. Problems with funding and support. With each passing day, Jamal and Sarah faced increasing financial difficulties. Due to constant threats and attacks, they were forced to close their offices and hire private security guards, which greatly depleted their budget. International human rights organizations that promised support often faced bureaucratic obstacles and a slow process for providing funding. This made their work difficult and created an additional sense of helplessness. In addition, local donors and businessmen who had previously supported them began to withdraw their funding, fearing negative attention and reprisals from racist groups and even local authorities. Jamal and Sarah found themselves in a position where they had to find alternative means of funding, including crowdfunding, which also faced sabotage attempts and threats. Security issues. With threats mounting, Jamal and Sarah were forced to constantly shift locations and go into hiding. They rented several hidden apartments, which they changed frequently to avoid surveillance. Lana Baker, a private investigator, worked to protect them and ensure their privacy. However, increasing violence from racist groups complicated their efforts. One night, while Jamal and Sarah were holding a meeting in one of the safe houses, they were discovered. In the morning, they found evidence of forced entry and destruction in the apartment. New threats were left on the walls, including photos of their children. This forced them to rethink their strategies and consider possible evacuation outside the country. Legal difficulties. The legal side of their case also proved extremely complicated. When they filed lawsuits against racist groups and corrupt officials, the trials dragged on. Opponents used every legal trick possible to slow down the process and make it difficult for them to access justice. The judges and lawyers who were supposed to work on their case also found themselves under pressure and threats, which created additional obstacles. Additionally, Jamal and Sarah faced challenges in collecting and presenting evidence. Evidence of corruption and connections between white supremacist groups and the government was complex and time-consuming to verify. Lana and her team worked to expose the cases, but they encountered resistance from both high-profile officials and local law enforcement, who sometimes directly aided white supremacist groups. Impact on personal life. The constant pressure and threats began to have a devastating effect on Jamal and Sarah's personal lives. They were unable to see friends and family out of fear for their safety. This isolation left them feeling lonely and stressed, making it difficult for them to work effectively and cope with the pressure. Psychological impact was another major issue. Jamal and Sarah began to experience symptoms of anxiety and post-traumatic stress, which negatively affected their physical and emotional well-being. Their interactions with therapists and support groups helped, but it did not solve all the problems. New alliances and support. Despite all the difficulties, Jamal and Sarah continued to seek new alliances and support. They established relationships with independent journalists who helped them report on the situation in the media. These journalists helped to draw attention to their case and expose some aspects of corruption and bias. International human rights groups began stepping up their efforts to support Jamal and Sarah, providing legal assistance and resources. They began organizing protests and campaigns to draw attention to the case, which brought new attention to issues of racism and corruption. preparing for the decisive step, Jamal and Sarah knew that despite all the difficulties, they had to take a decisive step to achieve their goal. They began preparing a final report on corruption and violence that would be presented to the international arena. This report contained the key evidence collected by Lana and her team and would serve as the basis for further action. In the face of constant threat and deteriorating security, they began to hide the report materials and prepare for the possibility of taking the case to international courts. Their determination remained strong despite the difficulties and fear, and they were ready to do whatever it took to achieve justice and expose the corruption. Jamal and Sarah's story continued to unfold, filled with realistic difficulties and challenges. Their fight for justice remained difficult and dangerous, but their efforts, despite all the obstacles, continue to inspire others and highlight the need for change in a system riddled with racism and corruption. Despite the mounting pressure and threats, Jamal and Sarah continued their fight for justice. Their final report was almost ready, and they planned to present it on the international stage. However, a few days before the planned presentation, something happened that changed their situation dramatically and put their entire investigation in jeopardy. An unexpected turn. One evening, as Jamal and Sarah were putting the finishing touches on their report, they received an anonymous message on their secure email accounts. The message contained a photograph taken through the window of their current hideout and a threat that if they did not stop their investigation, their loved ones would be in danger. The message alarmed them, but even more shocking was the second file attached to the email. This file contained details of their investigation and planned presentation that would only be known to people with access to their internal materials. This meant that someone in their inner circle could have been involved in the leak. Internal betrayal. Jamal and Sarah decided to conduct an emergency background check on everyone who had helped them, including private investigator Lana Baker. They began looking for possible leaks and suspected that some of their trusted people might be working for racist groups or corrupt officials. During his investigation, Jamal discovered that one of their old contacts, who worked for a human rights organization, was a close friend and former colleague of one of the high-profile officials named in their report. The contact, named Kevin, had previously promised to help disseminate information and prepare an international report, but his behavior had become suspicious. Kevin was invited to a meeting where Jamal and Sarah tried to find out if he was involved in the leak. During a tense conversation, Kevin admitted that he had been pressured and threatened by racist groups who, having learned of his connection to Jamal and Sarah, had used him to sabotage their work. Exposure and blackmail. Kevin said he was pressured to provide information about the investigation by threats to his family's lives. He also said racist groups had access to some of the critical material and were using it to plan attacks and interfere with court cases. Realizing that their work could be completely derailed, Jamal and Sarah decided to take action. They devised a plan to protect Kevin and his family, and began preparing to use his testimony to expose corruption and racism in high places. Shockingly, however, Kevin also revealed that some of their material had been used to create fake documents that racist groups planned to use to discredit their investigation. This meant that even if they were able to provide genuine evidence, the fake material could create confusion and distraction. Unknown ally. In this difficult situation, Jamal and Sarah decided to seek help from an independent journalist who had previously criticized corruption and racism but remained outside their circle of support. The journalist, Alex Martin, was known for his work exposing government misconduct and corruption, but his work had not always been recognized or supported in the past. Alex, having learned of Jamal and Sarah's difficult situation, agreed to help. He offered his resources and media connections to ensure maximum publicity and attention to their case. In exchange, Jamal and Sarah provided him with all the evidence they had collected and information about the fabricated materials, which allowed him to create a convincing and credible story. Consequences and strategic steps. With the help of Alex Martin and his team, Jamal and Sarah were able to publish exposés that revealed the real facts and exposed the fakes. This attracted the attention of international media and human rights organizations, creating a powerful public response. However, this move also brought even more pressure from racist groups and corrupt officials. The aggression increased, and Jamal and Sarah found themselves under threat once again. Despite this, their determination to continue the fight only grew stronger. They used new connections and resources to continue to uncover the truth and protect their lives. Jamal and Sarah's story continued to unfold, full of surprises and complications. Their fight for justice became even more intense, but they now had a new ally and fresh opportunities to expose corruption and racism. This added a new dimension to their fight and highlighted how deep and complex systems of oppression and the fight for truth can be. Jamal and Sarah's situation had reached a critical point. Their revelations had attracted international attention and created tensions at the highest levels, but it had also attracted more aggression and threats from racist groups and corrupt officials. Jamal and Sarah's location had become known to their enemies, and their safety was at risk. It was time to make a decisive move that could change everything. Preparing for the final act, Jamal and Sarah, working with Alec Martin and other allies, devised a strategy for the final presentation. Their plan was to hold an international press conference that would highlight all the facts that had been exposed and present irrefutable evidence of corruption and racism. They chose a neutral, secure location for the event, the headquarters of a major international human rights organization known for its human rights advocacy and independence. Representatives of international organizations, leading journalists, and human rights activists were invited to the conference. An unexpected blow. A few days before the conference, at the last minute, Jamal and Sarah received information that a major attack was planned on the event. The enemies had prepared a large-scale operation to sabotage and create chaos. They were counting on mass protests and provocations to disrupt the presentation and destabilize the situation. Jamal and Sarah, along with their allies, decided to change tactics. Instead of holding the conference in an open format, they decided to use covert recordings and technologies that allowed them to broadcast the material from a secure location. This solution required additional preparation and coordination, but it allowed them to maintain the security and integrity of the information. Day X. The day of the conference arrived and the world was on the brink of a major event. While an organized protest was taking place in the public area, distracting the police and media, the secret conference began in a secure room. As Jamal and Sarah began presenting their evidence, Alec Martin and his team began broadcasting to international news channels. Key documents, evidence of corruption and racist links were shown live. This included recordings of secret meetings, internal documents, financial charts and evidence linking the government to racist groups. The publication caused an international outcry. The live broadcast was captured by viewers around the world. Numerous leaders and human rights organizations immediately condemned the actions shown in the material. This created a huge public outcry and pressure on the authorities to take immediate action. Epic climax. In response to international pressure and protests, local authorities launched emergency investigations. At this critical moment, Jamal and Sarah, their team and allies were joined by international observers and human rights defenders. These organizations began to put additional pressure on corrupt structures, demanding immediate action. Soon after, mass arrests began. Important figures linked to corruption and racism were detained. Racist groups that had acted with open aggression were persecuted and punished. The international community expressed its support and demanded reforms to address systemic racism and corruption. Changes at the political and legal levels soon followed, including new transparency laws, reforms in law enforcement, and improvements in human rights protection. Conclusion. Despite all the difficulties, Jamal and Sarah were able to achieve their goal. Their persistence and determination in revealing the truth, despite numerous threats and betrayals, became a symbol of the fight for justice. They became heroes not only in their country, but throughout the world. Their story of struggle has shown that even in the face of deep-rooted racism and corruption, change can be achieved when you work with determination and the support of allies. Their efforts have helped expose systemic abuses and are an important step toward creating a more just society. Slowly, Jamal and Sarah were able to return to their normal lives, but their work was not over. They continued their advocacy, using their platform to help others and continuing to fight for justice in a new, more informed and responsible society. Their story is remembered as an epic example of fighting for truth and justice in the most difficult of circumstances. This is the end of this wonderful story. I hope you liked it, and you were imbued with this atmosphere. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel as it promotes my video. Thank you everyone for watching. Bye everyone.